And the reason why I said that is there is no such thing as a stress-free life. We don't live in Jannah, we live in dunya. What I wanted to leave you with in our short time here, trying to help myself and you, because this is a journey that we're all in together. And that is how to manage our lives. It's more about how to do our best with ihsan. There is no way that we're going to have a stress-free life. But how can we start to be able to manage and even flourish despite the obstacles? So I thought that I wanted to share 5 points with you. And the very first one has to do with, sort of why I changed the original title. And that is that the hard times will always come. That hard times are part of the nature of dunya. That there will be times where we will be tested. And there will be times where we will be under pressure. And the purpose of those tests, the purpose of that pressure is not ever to hurt or destroy the believer, but rather Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that the purpose of tests and the purpose of pressure and even the purpose of stress, when it is managed properly, is actually to strengthen us, to purify us, and to elevate us. If you look at this from even a sort of secular perspective, or even a literal physical perspective, if a person wants to grow in strength, or if a person wants to increase their perseverance in a physical sense, right? Their endurance, what does that person have to go through? That person has to go through a process of lifting heavier weight, a process of training, a process of going to the gym. There's a process that that person has to undergo in order to build that resilience and to build that endurance. For example, if you decide that you want to run a marathon, a person doesn't just wake up and say, I'm going to run a marathon today. But there is an entire process of training to run a marathon. And that training involves putting your body literally under stress, right? You have to train your body by going to the gym, by running smaller periods. You know that there is a process of getting yourself to a point where you have enough endurance and enough perseverance to be able to run a marathon. That process doesn't involve sitting on the couch as I am right now and getting comfortable. That process involves work, it involves struggle. So stress at a sort of an essential level is needed in order for us to grow. If we never experienced any kind of resistance or any kind of stress or any kind of lifting that we have to do, we wouldn't be able to grow, and we wouldn't become stronger. The first sort of principle that we need to realize is that the hard times will come, and that it is necessary, that it is not only that, it's kind of like one of these things that you want to avoid, but you have to go through, but it actually is an essential part of our growth and an essential part of our development in this life. It's an essential part of our purification as well. I'll just leave you with sort of an analogy about this particular point. And that is, if you think about the idea of a forest fire. So a forest fire is something that we don't usually think as a good thing. We don't think of as a good thing. We usually hear about forest fires at a point when they've gotten out of control, or they've reached residence neighborhoods where they've started to become a danger to us. But if you actually go and you study forest fires are in fact essential for the growth of the forest itself, which just blew my mind when I found this out. The fact that the fire itself isn't a problem, because actually trees and forests require some level of fire in order to clear out the forest floor and make space for new vegetation. So it's actually necessary. The fire at some level is necessary. So when does it become a problem? Well, it becomes a problem when it's out of control, right? The fire itself is essential to growth, but it's when it gets out of control that it causes destruction. Now the point is, how do I keep from allowing my forest fires in my own life from getting out of control? In other words, how do I keep from the stress becoming out of control or destroying me instead of growing me? That's the essential question, right? Where some level of lifting weight will make you stronger and thrive. Whereas if you put too much, you can break your back. The question is, number one, is realizing that the hard times will come and that some level of struggle and some level of lifting and some level of pressure is necessary. Not only is it inevitable, but it is actually necessary for our growth and our own thriving. So that's number one. Number two principle is that nothing is intrinsically difficult or easy in its own way, like in its own right, intrinsically, but rather how difficult and how easy something is actually dependent on how much help or how much we are depending on ourselves. So how much help we get from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala versus how much we are dependent upon ourselves. Let me explain that further. Any given situation, let's take the analogy of the weight that we have to carry in this life. The weight that we have to lift, that weight. So in the physical world, we would say that, okay, it's easy to lift 5 pounds, it's not so easy to lift 50 pounds. But there is another factor here that determines how easy it is to lift that weight. And that is, well, do I have a bodybuilder coming and helping me? Do I have some tools? Do I have a forklift that's actually lifting that weight? Or am I lifting it on my own? And this analogy then extends to, in the spiritual sense, how difficult or how easy a situation will be in my life is dependent upon how much help I get from Allah, and how much help I seek from Allah, and how dependent I am on myself versus how dependent I am on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So going back to the analogy, if one has to lift this really, really heavy thing, for example, here's a real life. While a brother was out of his country, while he was in Malaysia actually, there was a bad hurricane that hit the east coast of the United States, and he lived in the southeast part of the US in North Carolina. And apparently, while he was in Malaysia actually, while he was teaching, there was some very heavy winds that hit his city. And by the time he finished his seminar in Malaysia, he had received like a video and some photos from his neighbors, and he was like, his jaw dropped at what had happened while he was in Malaysia. So one of the trees, and we're talking about like a giant tree, very tall, he don't even know how tall this tree was, had fallen in his backyard. And the way it fell was away from the house. Because had this tree fallen in the other direction, it would have smashed through his home, right through the roof and into the home. And so he looked at this picture and he just literally gasped, because the entire tree had just become uprooted and was just lying down in his backyard, and it had fallen in the direction away from the house. Alhamdulillah. So many lessons from this. Obviously, the main lesson is that protection only comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He was not there. There was nothing he could have done to influence which way this tree fell. There was nothing he could have done to influence the wind, the direction of the wind, the speed of the wind, the intensity of the hurricane. But subhanallah, this was completely from the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's a very, very good reminder of the fact that we are always desperate for the protection of Allah, no matter where we are or how safe we think we are. We literally are not in control. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control. But going off of that, he now have this giant tree that he has to remove from his backyard, right? So how does he do that? Well, he can go and he can be like, okay, he was going to lift it, right? If he tries to lift this tree by himself, he's going to break completely. I mean, it'll crush him. If he tries to lift this tree by himself, he can break his back. He can become completely crushed by this tree. But if he hires someone who uses a forklift, who now has this help to lift the tree, is it heavy for him? It's still the same job that needs to be done. He could either try to lift it himself, or he can get someone to get a tool, to get this forklift and have that forklift lift up the tree and take care of the tree. Now, that's no weight for him, right? That's not a struggle for him, even though it's the exact same outcome. So when we go through stress in our life, or we go through difficulty in our life, we can either try to lift it ourselves, and basically break our backs or get crushed. Or we can look to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for help, and look to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for ease and assistance. This is a lesson that we're taught every single day of our lives, at least 5 times a day. We call out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. You alone do we worship, and you alone do we seek help from. Nasta'een. So one essential lesson here, one essential principle in terms of dealing with stress every day from small to big, what is it? إِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. That you alone do we seek help from. The isti'ana part, we have to seek help from Allah. We cannot depend on ourselves. You think about that analogy of that tree, right? If I'm going to try to lift it myself, I will break my back, I will get crushed. But if I get help in lifting, that becomes easy for me. And so this is the second principle that we have to realize, and that is that it's really summed up in one of the du'as that we're taught to say during times of difficulty. And that is, Allahumma la sahla illa ma ja'altahu sahla. That, oh Allah, there is nothing is easy except what you make easy. Allahumma la sahla illa ma ja'altahu sahla. Oh Allah, there is nothing easy except what you make easy. وَأَنْتَ تَجْعَلُ الْحَزْنَ إِذَا شِئْتَ سَهْلًا. And you can make what is difficult, what looks externally difficult, feel easy, if you will. This is a very profound concept and a very important concept to understand. And that is that nothing is difficult or easy in and of itself, right? And intrinsically, but rather its difficulty or ease is dependent upon how much help I have from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How much assistance has Allah given me? Has Allah enabled me to lift this? Has Allah lifted it for me? Has Allah tied my heart as He did for the mother of Musa alayhi salam? That concept that we're taught in the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَرَبَّتْنَا عَلَى قَلْبِهَا. Allah says that had we not tied her heart together, that Allah is teaching us here that even the most difficult situations, like putting your baby into the river and just putting your trust in Allah, that even that situation she was enabled, like she was able to handle it only because Allah tied her heart together. What this teaches us is that if we have the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our lives, you know, from the small to the big, from the nuisances in our life, all the way to the huge calamities, that if Allah helps us, that He can make what is difficult feel easy. And that's what this teaches us. Allahumma la sahla illa ma ja'altahu sahla. Oh Allah, nothing is easy except what you make easy. Wa anta, and that you can make what actually looks or seems difficult feel easy, if you will. وَأَنْتَ تَجْعَلُ الْحَزْنَ إِذَّا شِعْتَ سَحْلًا. That what is actually difficult or seems difficult, you can make it easy, if you will. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by this dua and several other du'as. You know, there's not enough time right now to get into all of these du'as, but this is a concept that we have to understand, which is that I should not rely on myself in anything that I do in my life, but that I, especially when I'm going through hard times, to seek the help and aid and assistance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that will make it lighter. And that will make it easier for me. And you just, think of the analogy of that tree. Either lift it yourself and you break your back along the way, or you get a forklift. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be our forklift, right? To lift our burdens and to make them light upon us. Because if I have that forklift, or I have someone driving that forklift, this burden of removing this tree becomes light on me. And that's what we ask from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to make our burdens light. So that's number 2. Number 3 is that we have to lean into the good, or change or manage our focus. What this is about is basically a summary of the whole concept of gratitude, daily practice of gratitude. Because our lives change depending on what we focus on in our lives. I say many times, what you focus on grows. And so if you are the type of person who just basically trains your mind to focus on the good, to focus on the things that you love, the things that are gifts and blessings in your life, and you show gratitude for those things, then those things will grow. Not only will they grow, because Allah will give you more. Allah says that if you are thankful, I will increase you. So not only does Allah give us more when we show gratitude, but also from a psychological perspective, when we show gratitude and when we focus on our blessings, they actually grow in our own minds. We see them as being bigger. We experience them as being all-encompassing. We're not enlarging our difficulties, we're enlarging our blessings. But it works the other way as well. If we are the type of person who focuses only on the things we don't like, on our problems, everything that's missing, everything is not good enough in our lives, sometimes we only focus on everything that's not good enough in ourselves too. We do this to ourselves, and we do a lot of sort of self-flagellation, beating ourselves up, where like we could have a lot of good qualities and a lot of strengths, but instead we just focus on that one thing that we don't like. We do this, in our physical appearance, but we also do this with our strengths and our weaknesses. That sometimes by focusing on the things we don't like in ourselves, we're also enlarging them, and we become they can become very overwhelming. I'm not saying that we don't try to improve, we definitely should. But it's very dangerous to focus on the negative. It's very dangerous to focus only on the things that are missing, the things that are not as we want them. They start to look bigger, and we start to become overwhelmed. And when something looks bigger, it obviously becomes heavier, and it starts to weigh on us. And so our life will feel heavier. Our problems start to feel a lot heavier. And so it's very, very important to actively force ourselves, even if we're not in this habit and we're not used to it, maybe because of our upbringing, maybe because of a lot of modeling that we saw in our parents, that we have to train our brains to focus on the good, to focus on the blessings, because inna ma'al usri yusra, with the difficulty is ease. Inna ma'al usri yusra, in a very general sense. And Allah repeats this. It's important that we're training ourselves to show gratitude, to focus on the good, and not to be the type of person who only focuses on what is negative or what's missing in our lives. The fourth principle is not to lose hope. A lot of times we can become very exhausted. The title implies burnout. I've been doing this and it's just not working. I've been trying for this outcome and I keep failing. No matter how hard I try, I just keep falling. It's easy to become discouraged. I personally get a lot of inspiration from the story of Hajar. Because Hajar, this is a story of a woman who was in a very, very impossible situation, and she could have given up. She tried looking on Safa for any sign of life or any sign of help, any sign of anything. She found nothing. She could have given up, but she didn't. She ran to the next mountain, which is Marwa, right? Again, she could have given up after that, but she didn't. She went back to Safa. And then she could have given up, then she didn't. She went back to Marwa, and she could have given up then, but she didn't. She went back to Safa, and she did this 7 times. So there's a lot to reflect on here that Allah is teaching us, to look at this woman who was all alone in the desert with her baby, and both are almost at their death there from dehydration, right? And yet, she never gave up. She went between Safa and Marwa, not once or twice, but 7 times. There's a lesson here about not giving up, not losing hope, and continuing to strive, even when we are not seeing immediate results. I use this example when a person goes and plants a tree. They planted the tree, and maybe after 6 months, they don't see any result. It's not working. It's not working. Maybe another year, that maybe if the seed is under the ground, say, you may not see any results, and you may think that it isn't working, but it's growing. And there's a process that it has to go through. So don't lose hope and become discouraged because you're not seeing immediate results. To continue to strive like Safa, like Hajar alayha salam, between Safa and Marwa. Sometimes that sa'i, the sa'i needs to strive. Sometimes that sa'i has to be over and over and over. And it's part of the process. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us that things require a process. When a baby is being developed inside the womb of the mother, Allah could have just said, kun fayakun, and a woman just gives birth after a day. Allah could have done that. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala designed it so it would take 9 long, maybe sometimes difficult months. This is part of the process. This is the sunnah of Allah, that everything requires a process. And sometimes, when a woman, first conceives, when the woman is pregnant and is just at the very, very beginning of her pregnancy, you might look at her and be like, there's nothing happening. You know what I mean? And then you see her after 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month, and you're like, it's not working, there's nothing really happening there. But the reality is that there is something happening, but it is unseen. And there is growth, and there is change, but it is unseen. And so sometimes the change in our lives, the growth in our lives is unseen, just like that seed that was under the ground. It is growing, and it is changing, but we can't see it at that point. Same thing with that, with the embryo that is developing. But you can't see it. And you might think, oh, there's nothing happening, you don't have an ultrasound. You might not even think anything's happening. And so within our lives, sometimes the change and the growth is unseen, but that doesn't mean that it isn't happening. And so we have to be able to sort of persevere through the lack of results, and sometimes through the unseen, and to realize that everything requires a process, and sometimes we're not going to see immediate results. Finally, principle 5, number 5, is that this too shall pass, and every single thing in this life is temporary. While this reality can sometimes give us, sadness, well, the good things aren't going to last, but neither are the hard things. Everything about this life is temporary, the good and the bad. No storm lasts forever. Just like the sun is not always going to be out, and sometimes the sun is going to set. Similarly, it isn't going to be night forever. It's never going to be night forever. If you are in a situation right now where it just feels really dark, and it just feels like there's so much pressure and it's really dark, realize that if you study the nature of this life, if you study the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no night lasts forever, the sun always rises again. And that is the nature of this life, that it is always moving, it is always changing, and that everything eventually returns to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Kullu man alayha fan, every single thing is passing away. Everything is temporary. This should give us comfort in our difficult times as well, because no difficult time will last forever. And it will always change, and it will always become, insha'Allah, better, because just like the night that turns into day, our difficulties will also be alleviated. Getting through it is part of getting through it, is being able to persevere and then also continue to have hope, because this too shall pass.